Good evening and welcome to another edition of Arizona Wildlife Views. I'm your host, Ian Satter. Here in Arizona, we love to talk about the weather, the perfect winters, the scorching summers, and we actually count the number of days it rains here in Arizona. Our first story, we're going to take a look at what happened when we had a record-setting 143 days without rainfall.
This is kind of the nicest part of the trail too. With this.
Winter in Arizona. For visitors from colder climates, it's relief from the tedium of shoveling snow. A chance to relax at a world-class resort or tee off at one of our famous golf courses.
Nice one.
For locals, it's time to escape from air-conditioned buildings, time to rise from the summer siesta. Get out and revel in the cool and mild winter weather. The fierce monsoon storms of summer fade into memory as winter's gentler rains bring much-needed water to the desert, usually starting in October and tapering off toward March. Everywhere the rains touch, the earth is vibrant, alive, lush. In a normal year, that is.
This year, it's anything but lush. Matter of fact, the plants are probably in as poor condition as possibly be conceived.
Last winter, rains didn't start as expected in October or November, and by the time a dry December ended with still no rain in sight, anxious residents looked at the stubborn blue sky and asked each other, what happened to the winter rains? Well, what happened was the rains didn't fall. In fact, Phoenix weathered 143 days of no rain, a feat that had never occurred before, and we can only hope it doesn't happen again. You see, that lack of rain took a heavy toll on the desert and the plants and animals that call it home. To many people, the saguaro cactus epitomizes the Sonoran Desert, a silent sentinel standing with outstretched arms to welcome all who call this place home. Supremely adapted for desert conditions, saguaros are built to avoid moisture loss. Like many other desert plants, they are actually able to store energy that was collected during the day by carrying on photosynthesis at night. Temperatures are cooler then, allowing saguaros to lose far less moisture than if they sweated during the day.
They are what we call a drought resistor. So when conditions get dry, saguaros just keep plugging along. They put their heads down and they just do what they've done for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The pleats that we see on the saguaro actually act like an accordion, and because the plant can take up water so rapidly, these pleats will expand when a saguaro gets lots of moisture, and they contract when the saguaro has less moisture. And this is one of the ways that the stem can swell up and shrink very rapidly, is because of these pleats.
Saguaros have a central taproot that goes down a few feet or so. The rest of the roots expand out from the plant in a circle that is about as wide as the cactus is tall.
These roots are very close to the surface, about 4 inches or so, and they are able to put out hairs or little fibers out of the root very quickly when moisture is available. That increases their ability to take up moisture. And so these plants very rapidly take advantage of even the lightest rainfall, and that goes into the saguaro's mass.
Another equally famous resident of the Sonoran Desert, the prickly pear cactus, is also a drought resistor. But even the prickly pear had a tough time last winter.
Things like this prickly pear would be twice as thick as it is right now. When we look at this pad right here, and it's paper thin.
But sometimes things look worse than they actually are. Even a dead-looking cactus can spring back to life when moisture conditions change.
They're very drought resistant. This plant is far from being dead, and matter of fact, it would take a lot worse conditions than this to kill it. But it exists here in the Sonoran Desert just because it is so tough and it is so drought resistant.
Borrowing a trick from the saguaro, the jojoba also photosynthesizes at night.
This plant has thick, leathery leaves, and it loses very little moisture through them, and so it's able to ride out these droughts pretty well.
But not all plants in the Sonoran Desert are drought resistors. Some have developed other methods to survive in these extreme times.
Unlike cactus, which resist drought conditions, ocotillas and many other plants go dormant when conditions turn unfavorable. So a plant like this, as the conditions dry out, it drops its leaves and it goes into a dormancy. It actually photosynthesizes through this green bark that you see, and that keeps the plant alive. But within a matter of days after a rainfall event, this plant can put on a whole new set of leaves and look like a very different, very vibrant, very alive plant.
One of the amazing things that happens when an ocotillo comes out of dormancy is the green areas actually expand, and that allows the plant to take in more light and produce leaves.
So the canes are supposed to twist, or the branches are supposed to twist open, exposing these larger green windows, and then the plant wakes up and starts, making food and puts on leaves like that.
The burr sage is another desert staple. It typically goes dormant in the summer, but it can remain dormant during a dry winter like the last one, producing much smaller leaves than it would during a wet winter.
These little tiny leaves we see are characteristic of the months of June and early July and late May. These leaves lose little moisture because they're so small, but it allows the plant to manufacture food. Typically this time of year, instead of having these little leaves, it would have a leaf that's about half the size of the palm of my hand. And those are the winter leaves, or the wet period leaves. And this plant just can't afford to do it on a year like this.
We're in one of the worst dry spells in the history of this state. For the past 10 years, Arizona has received below normal rainfall. When you live in a place that only gets about 7 inches of rain annually, well, every drop counts. Plant species have adapted to periodic drought in ways that help individual plants like saguaro, prickly pear, and burr sage to survive a dry spell. Wildlife species, on the other hand, tend to adapt by decreasing their numbers so that the species as a whole can survive. The situation for individual birds and animals caught in drought conditions can be tough.
Situation couldn't possibly be more dire for wildlife. Wildlife handles dry spells or drought situations in two basic ways. There are wildlife that respond very quickly to the environmental conditions, things like quail and rabbits and rodents, that if you get a wet spell, they reproduce very rapidly and their populations come up very drastically. If it's dry, the reproduction is much lower and suitable for the conditions that the environment offers.
And then we have larger animals that are slower to respond to conditions like drought. A good example is our desert mule deer. Deer populations shrink and grow more slowly than rabbit or quail populations do. Deer populations can grow during a long wet period, but if you have a protracted dry period, the population of deer typically dwindles or drops.
We've had some years where it's been so dry here in Arizona, the does haven't even been in good enough shape to fawn.
Some years are wet enough in winter that the deer will have fawns, but those can be lost in a particularly dry summer. Deer need both a wet winter and a wet summer to produce more deer.
On a year like this, we're predicting that the does aren't even going to ovulate. They're not even going to be in good enough shape to reproduce, and that overall trend of declining deer populations are going to continue.
The drought creates a challenging situation for predators as well, such as bobcats, coyotes, and black bears. Scientific evidence to date suggests that predator numbers follow prey numbers, but lag a couple of years behind.
So in other words, if we have the deer population coming up and spiking, we have the mountain lion population coming up and spiking a year or two after to take advantage of this abundance of deer. And likewise, when we have a decline in the prey species, a year or two later, the predator species decline along with them.
A predator population that has remained high when a prey population has started to drop due to drought can face tough times as its food sources shrink with no replacement in sight. Predator numbers then drop until they are more in line with the availability of prey.
I only wish that we had a crystal ball that we could see what's going to happen down the road, because we'd be much better biologists and much better managers of your wildlife. Our big fear on a year like this is conditions are so poor out there that we're going to see an influx of wildlife into urban areas.
We saw this several years back with young bears coming into town because weather conditions were so poor
I don't think he's going anywhere right now.
that the mast and fruit crops they depend on to get in shape for winter were non-existent.
So the potential that these animals could be coming into your backyard or your neighborhood, into these urban fringe areas, we feel has increased.
But it's not all doom and gloom. As we watch the desert sky, we know that eventually the clouds will blow in, releasing their precious cargo of refreshing rain. Once again, the cycle will complete itself. The plants and animals can satisfy their thirst and get on with the business of life. Poppy seeds that have laid dormant on the desert floor for years now erupt in blazes of glory, heralding better times to follow.
Rain, or lack thereof, can have a dramatic impact on our lakes and reservoirs, but so can non-native species, even the tiniest ones.
There is a new predator lurking in our lakes, a hostile, invasive species that secretes toxins deadly to small fish and clams. What is this intruder? Some type of giant mutated monster? No. It's a microscopic, one-celled aquatic organism called Primnesium parvum, better known as golden algae.
About 4 years ago, we started getting a lot of fish kills out here. We've been taking a look at it for a number of years, and we found out that we have a golden algae in the system. That's the cause of the problems we have out here.
The algae produces two toxins that attack the sensitive gills of fish, essentially causing them to suffocate. The good news is that these toxins are not harmful to humans. The Arizona Game and Fish Department is part of a multi-agency effort to respond to and examine the golden algae problem.
And last year and the year before that, we were out here all the time when the fish were dying. It starts to get a little bit too much for one crew or one department, so we put together a team and we work cooperatively with these other agencies.
This is our Van Dorn bottle. Let me get that off. There you go. It arms like this, with the two ends which come up here. One of our specialized pieces of equipment or contraption, as it seems. And this is opens at the ends, and there's a messenger, weighted messenger, which sends down. We send down on the rope, and it presses in there and captures the water sample when the ends close.
Fisheries biologists Kevin Bright and Mark Dahlberg are collecting water samples in Saguaro Lake. They collect water from a pre-selected set of depths to keep their samples consistent. They use several different instruments so they can get a clear look at the water quality of the lake to help figure out what conditions may be favorable or unfavorable to the golden algae. The University of Arizona Environmental Research Laboratory in Tucson is one of the labs that is analyzing the samples collected by Mark and Kevin. Dr. David Walker is in charge of the research.
Well, the first thing, is just the basic research. And believe it or not, a lot of that basic research is unknown, and it's not easy to do either. It is one of those things where we're uncertain of exact environmental conditions needed to grow or produce toxin in general. Does it produce toxin all the time? We don't know. Is there a correlation between the numbers that we find in the water and toxicity? There seems to be a rough correlation, but it's certainly not linear. In other words, it's not strict.
Golden algae is not only an invasive species, but an evasive one as well. It is so small that a single drop of water may contain thousands of cells, so even collecting actual samples of the algae required new protocols and equipment. Dr. Walker had to invent the device that is currently being used.
So what we've come up with is a device, this has required new and novel sampling techniques. We've come up with a device which is basically to pump water out of the lake into a net that's not towed behind the boat, but rather just through the net, and then the remaining water goes back into the lake, but we've still retained our sample of algae.
Algae has always been in our lakes, but what triggers it to produce toxins is part of the mystery we are trying to solve. Golden algae in its present form is new to Arizona waterways, so where did it come from and how did it get here?
We don't know that. There's a lot of transport mechanisms. It could be people moving their boats around or fishing equipment, or it could even be blown in here on the wind. We just don't know. We've known that Texas has been having a problem with it since the mid-'80s. Then it moved over and hit New Mexico. And we joined the club about a year ago when we figured out what was causing the problems out here.
Many invasive species have been introduced to our lakes and waterways in recent years. You can help prevent further contamination by making sure you are not transporting any unwanted hitchhikers from one body of water to another. Golden algae is also becoming a major management issue in Phoenix area urban lakes, where it can wreak havoc in some of these popular fishing waters.
Well, we're at Albert Lake. We're working at the City of Phoenix, and they're the ones that actually are applying this chemical. It's called Cutrine Plus, and we wanted to help them because this is a pretty big lake, so we bring a boat out here so we can hit all the areas of the lake with that chemical.
The algicide treatments in urban lakes have been effective, but they are impractical for large bodies of water, like the reservoirs along the Salt River.
The cure now is once you have golden algae, you're going to have it. We're not going to get rid of it. The smaller urban lakes, we can go out there and get a handle on it by treating it with chelated copper compounds. We try to understand what we're dealing with, and the more data and information we can get, maybe we can manage around it.
Even with the problems golden algae is creating, the overall health of Arizona's lakes and reservoirs is still good.
It's pretty good. Whatever happens in these reservoir systems is affected by what's happening on the watershed above the reservoirs. So the Rodeo Chedeski fire 4 or 5 years ago burned 500,000 acres in the Salt River watershed. It impacted the water quality. It changed it. It's still good water quality, it's just different.
Lake managers, biologists, and chemists are searching for answers to better understand and combat this invader. They are looking at how it got here, how to predict when it will give off toxins, what its strengths and weaknesses are, and how to kill it before it kills fish.
It's no less difficult than looking at human diseases. It's no less difficult than finding cures for several human diseases. By the time you start looking at the possible iterations that you could look at in regards to variables, the number becomes very large. But it doesn't mean you don't start someplace. And that's where we're at, is kind of at the beginning.
The problems presented by golden algae are complex and new to us. But we are moving closer to answering some of the riddles posed by this microscopic invader.
Not all non-native species are as small as golden algae. In fact, some of them are big enough to eat. Come along with us now as we take you to an old-fashioned crayfish festival.
We're not in the Louisiana Bayou. This is Willow Springs Lake in northeastern Arizona, the site of the second annual Crayfish Festival. The event was born out of the idea that crayfish are bad for Arizona's environment, but delicious to eat.
My family's originally from Louisiana. Grandpa moved the family out here in the 60s, 64, but we still have a lot of Cajun heritage and a lot of family back there, and very much still involved in the Cajun lifestyle. And one day last year, my dad had read an article about how bad crawfish were for the Arizona rivers and streams, and that they're eating the fish population and the vegetation. And so he said, I'm going crawfishing. But he said that on the radio. And with about 100,000 listeners, there are a lot of people that are interested in joining him. He said, if you want to go, call me. We had a lot of people call and had a really good turnout last year, but we ran out of crawfish in about 25, 30 minutes.
So, this year, the organizers and volunteers began setting their traps out several days ahead of time. They go out once in the morning and again in the evening to collect their catch.
I'm Arnie, Trapper Arnie I call myself, because I do trap. I trap crayfish primarily, and it's a hobby.
We have around 25 people up here this weekend. We've set 55 traps, and we've been trapping since Friday at around, well, Friday afternoon. And we've probably come up with, I would say, at least 3,000 crayfish. It's a little hard to estimate. We had huge buckets full of crayfish. Yes. Last night, this is about a third of what we got from last night.
Crayfish are a freshwater crustacean closely related to the lobster and somewhat smaller than their Louisiana cousins. They are not native to Arizona, and this invasive omnivore is doing a lot of damage to our lakes and streams. That's why it's so important to remove as many as possible. Remember, you do need a state Class A fishing license to catch crayfish, but there is no limit on the number you can take. By the time this weekend was over, the catch totaled 400 pounds, or about 8,000 crayfish.
Crayfish were intentionally introduced many, many years ago. They were introduced for vegetation control, and they were also introduced, obviously, as a bait item. And I think folks thought that they were doing the right thing. Today we know that there are some resource damages that are associated with crayfish, which are not native to our state.
Of course, we're fishermen, and so we're concerned about the fishing possibilities, but anyone who's a sportsman in Arizona needs to be concerned about the crayfish impact and how they affect various types of creatures in aquatic habitat.
They eat a lot of the minnows, a lot of the fish eggs, and they eat a lot of the vegetation that keeps the lakes from turning into mud puddles.
That's a big one. Man.
That's one of our most popular family activities, is to go out with nets and traps and just do nothing but have a lunch and net and trap crayfish, and then we prepare them and eat the larger ones at least, and just have a good time.
Which takes us to the main event. Over 800 people came out to sample the lobster-like delicacy. The cook knows what he's doing too. He is Pierre Romero, the owner of Baby K's Cajun Kitchen in Phoenix.
Right now we're just dropping in the crawfish with corn and potatoes and onions and some special seasoning. Bring them back up to a boil, cut the fire, and then let them soak like they are right now. And that way they absorb all that flavor. And then you just dump them out on the table and go to it.
And there's lots more coming.
Eating crayfish seems to involve a lot more peeling than eating.
Hard to get it out.
But all that effort does pay off.
Delicioso.
Very, very good.
Good.
Radio talk show host Rosie Romero even demonstrates the best way to eat them.
And then you pinch down here at the bottom, and then you just put it in your mouth and pull it out. If you really want the seasoning, you crush the head and suck the brains out.
A lot of strange people suck the head, so you can try that if you'd like. It's overrated.
So why does the Romero family and all the other volunteers work so hard to put this festival on each year?
You know, I love crawfish, for one. I'd sit there and I'd eat myself to death if there was enough in front of me.
Seriously, though, the festival is a fun way to get across a very serious message.
We use crayfish as a way to help remind the public that intentional or accidental importation of some species can be a real resource damage to the state of Arizona. We want to make sure that we address our behaviors and we know how to avoid accidental introductions. And if we're considering an intentional introduction, we consider the risks very, very, very carefully.
And there are things the public can and should do to help keep future aquatic pests out of our lakes and streams.
We do lots of things without even thinking. We load our boat up after a fishing trip, perhaps in one part of the state or even in another state. But do we take the time to stop and look to see whether we're dragging any weeds with us? Do we take a look inside our live well and make sure it's cleaned out? we make sure there's no mud that might harbor things like New Zealand mud snails. Making sure our equipment is clean is a great way for us to avoid accidental introductions.
In the meantime, we can all look forward to the next Crayfish Festival, where everybody can capture a little Cajun spirit and help rid our lakes of this most unwanted guest.
Well, that's our show for tonight. If you'd like any more information on the things you've seen on this episode, check out our website at azgfd.gov. For producers Carol Lynn and Gary Schaefer, I'm your host Ian Satter. Thanks for watching.